Could I just borrow those for a second, please?
Try the notes. Oh, clear off. They're just little prompts.
Stephen Dempster, welcome with your notes. And myself and Tim have nothing. We've had no preparation, although you have been how long working on this?
Nearly 2 years now.
Yeah. So we feel we don't need notes.
Yeah, you're very unprofessional. Lucky
I had dreams of doing that. I was actually going to rip them up and throw them to see what your face looked
just
like.
say that drain from my face.
Yeah. Right. The 2 years you were working on was, of course, a 4-part BBC panorama. Is it panorama?
No, it's a 4-part. It was commissioned by BBC Northern Ireland, and they came to Network Current Affairs, who would make the panoramas.
Yeah.
So it's the same department that made the panorama on Daniel Kinahan in boxing in 2021.
Yeah.
So that's the background to it.
So, and you were working on that, and you, at the time, were like feeling you were leaving everything behind. There was so much to the story. You wanted to return to it. You're a boxing fan yourself.
Yeah, so the panorama started really because I'm a boxing fan and I had some knowledge of the Kinahans, not the knowledge I have now. It started when Tyson Fury put out the infamous tweet about Daniel Kinahan. We got a panorama commissioned about Daniel and boxing. And you're right, when we left that panorama, there was so much. I mean, we're about to put out 4 hours of television.
Yeah.
This story could take 20 hours of television, and the amount of stuff we've got that'll never see the light of day. So that's where it all started. After the panorama, there was unfinished business and the BBC came back to it.
So it has taken you across the world.
It has, yeah. Holland, Spain, America. Been anywhere else?
Yeah, we did.
With the UK, you've been
the story
here.
Goes further. We didn't fancy going to Dubai, but...
And literally, I suppose you start... No, I wouldn't blame you on that. I wouldn't be going there myself either. And really, that's where the story remains, because as we're speaking, I think we were all of the opinion when you started working on it that maybe we might have at the very least seen Sean McGovern back at this point in time. Still out there. Nothing, no news coming. Extradition treaty signed by the Irish government and authorities in Dubai. But it just is very difficult to get information there, isn't it? Very difficult to know.
In the end, we took an editorial decision really not to try to get into Dubai for various obvious reasons. It's so hard, as you know, to get information out of Dubai. And when we started this process over 18 months ago, and we were in conversations with you, Tim and I both thought potentially Sean McGovern, maybe Daniel Kinahan would be arrested and back by now. And here, because actually when we started this process was around the time the file went in down here. The police put the file in. Is it PPS or DPP down here?
The DPP,
DPP.
And still here we are, I mean, it's you know, you just feel stupid sometimes continually saying, you know, they'll be back soon, but yeah, it's
but
just...
Those are the messages, aren't they? The kind of soft signals that everyone keeps getting are it's in process. Any minute now, it's in process any minute now. But as you know from, you know, the Eden Gashinan case and others, even when there is an arrest and all the rest of it, even that doesn't necessarily, and Sean McGovern, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. It's
it doesn't necessarily,
world.
And yet one of these days, I've no doubt, we'll be on the phone and it'll happen quickly when it eventually does happen. But tackling the story of the Kinahans, so, I mean, I, for one, have been writing about them for probably quite a large portion of my adult life. But you have to start somewhere with it, don't you? And maybe Dublin and Oliver Bond is as good a place as any. And, you know, there you went and saw what it's like now, but where they grew up.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly hard to work out where to start. And you almost didn't want to start at the beginning because you kind of want people to know where this is going to end. Because if you just tell the early story of Christy Kinahan as a kind of emerging heroin dealer, you kind of think, yeah, there's lots of stories like that. But you kind of need to know that it's going to end where it ends with this big, you know, enormous international cartel.
Yeah.
But yeah, that Oliver Bond period is fascinating because it feels like we kind of view this story in kind of levels. You know, there's kind of Christy Kinahan on his own, and it's almost Christy Kinahan and Sons, Kinahan International, and then don't know, what would you call it now? But this giant kind of multinational almost.
Yeah, global enterprises or something.
And that feels like a real moment, that kind of Oliver Bond era when the two boys are coming of age.
Like, yeah, they are in that place. And we went down and, of course, you know, people have to live there and there's always, you know, people are proud of that area all the same, but there is a lot of complaints to local TDs about it being a drug supermarket, about kids having to go to school, past people selling, you know, crack cocaine and everything. And it's hard to believe when you look down into Oliver Bond and then you're looking at the kind of homes that they're living in now and the lifestyle they have in Dubai. And I think, is it Michael O'Sullivan says at the beginning of your first episode, they've come a long way. Yeah. Which is so apt.
That is the thing. Well, the way we've mapped it out across 4 hours of television, eventually we do start following a chronological path. And with Christy Senior's early days and getting caught in the inner city with heroin, by the time we get to the end of episode 4, and they're in this area that you've covered so well with other journalists in this city, but by the time they're in Dubai or when they're in Spain and they've reached the level of what looks like multimillionaires. And by the time the Americans are chasing them and they're allegedly involved with Hezbollah and their tentacles are all over the world, you can't get your head around it. It's mind-blowing. And when you strip it back that far to Oliver Bond, to where it is now, it almost doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and it sometimes does feel absolutely mind-blowing. What I wanted to ask you was, right, some of the characters involved that you've spoken to, and many of them have spent their careers in some way focused on the Kinahans. Seamus Boland from the Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau, he's the chief there. And the late John O'Driscoll is also in he was an assistant commissioner when he retired and very tragically died not that long after he retired and just as he published his own book. But he was he was there from the beginning all the way through. He was in the North Inner City when the heroin epidemic started. Seamus Boland came up close and personal to Christy Kinahan way back in 1992 and is still spending his career time chasing him down, essentially. But John O'Driscoll, I notice you used his interview in the documentary. Did you have to go to the family to speak to them in the aftermath of his death?
I went to John O'Driscoll's posthumous book launch and had a chat with the family. And I'm glad you've raised John O'Driscoll and Seamus Boland. Listen, we're BBC journalists. We remain impartial, and quite often we're engaged in interviews holding police to account. But I do think when Tim and I were on our travels and doing a lot of research in the early days, we met with people in the community in the North Inner City. And one person that I remember is the former Lord Mayor of Dublin, Niall Ring. Yeah, he said to me very early on, and this was when John O'Driscoll was still alive. He said, he's the hero of this piece. He's the hero of this tale. And the reason he said that was that, and we started to find this out from other people, was that John O'Driscoll seemed to get the community. And even when the guards at times were unpopular in the North Inner City, we were told he could still go in. And we even spoke to people who were who John O'Driscoll used as a go-between at times into that community, who spoke so highly of him. And you're right, what's fascinating about Seamus Boland, John O'Driscoll, Dave Gallagher, also of Drugs and Organised Crime, these guys worked the inner city, worked the beat, and saw this story. It's like you as well, or a Paul Williams, and to some extent a Stephen Breen as well. This has been your career as well. And everybody, they've tracked them as cops. You tracked them as journalists. And before we get off the John O'Driscoll topic, I think one thing's important to say. We struggled with this story to get gangsters to talk, criminals, and people who would know Daniel up front and personal. So the journalists and the police end up telling a lot of the story, and it's like a hunt. We always saw it as like catching the Kinahans, and it's a hunt. And I would say John O'Driscoll, in the end, was at the forefront of that. And it's so sad that he's passed now. But his crowning achievement were the sanctions, which we'll come to.
I'm John O'Driscoll. I held the appointment of senior officer in charge of tackling serious and organised crime, which included trying to deal with the aftermath of the Regency Hotel incident. Once we realised that the target, in fact, was Daniel Kinahan, we knew that there could be serious consequences. These were juggernauts of organised crime that were clashing.
Seamus had great stories about John going to those concerned parents against drugs meetings when you'd have an entire room of furious people. Where are the guards? Why aren't you doing anything about these drug dealers? And John had this ability, as Seamus tells it, to kind of just calm everyone down, explain what he was doing. And then he had this line he would deliver at the end of it. He'd say, right, now I'm off to catch some more heroin dealers. And by the end of it, he'd be clapped out of the room by it.
Yeah.
And the idea of someone being clapped out of a guard being clapped out of a community hall like that at the time was phenomenal.
Just shows his popularity. Interesting conversations you had, and not everything makes it into the documentary, but you spoke to Seamus Boland about where he and John O'Driscoll were when the Regency occurred, because I remember where I was in this building. You've spoken to actually Ernie Leslie and Alan Cherry from the Sunday World about that day and how they went to the Regency. They kind of reconstruct actually exactly where they were that day and everything. And Ernie Leslie took that famed photograph of the two gunmen running from the hotel. But Boland, I think, told you that they were having coffee.
They were in a coffee shop in near Harcourt Police Station. And it was getting towards 2:00 on the Friday. They were there to talk police business, and they got the phone call to say there'd been the shooting. And like a lot of stuff, 99% of what we've done is not in the 4 hours. It's just the nature of it. So this story isn't even in it. But Seamus and John both would recount that they knew that moment was a game changer. That were the exact words. They knew nothing was going to be the same after that. We know infamously, and you and I have talked about it, that the guards were not at the Regency that day, and it was a big criticism of them. And so they didn't have eyes on the Regency that day, but it changed the gangland situation in Dublin. It changed the policing situation, and they had to react to it, and they eventually did.
And you know what? Would it have made any difference if they had eyes there that day? Do you think it wouldn't have gone off? Do you think it would have gone off? Do you think it would have made any?
I don't know. You don't know whether...
they would have only had a couple of undercover officers, I imagine, at the very most.
But the interesting point I think they both made is that they compared it to that Veronica Guerin moment as a kind of, I think, seminal moment was the word that John, and it was one of those moments again, I think John says, where people were concerned that organised crime had taken a grip and that nobody, including the state, could control it anymore. And and that's exactly what it seems to have felt like to people. That
it did feel like that. It definitely did feel like that. And, you talk about before the Regency and after the Regency, there's all sorts of events. The big C one there a couple of years ago, don't we measure everything we did before COVID, after COVID. Yeah. But that's a little bit like that. And, when I'm working or I'm heading to work, I do think, did that happen before or after that? So it is that seminal event. And obviously it's why this, incredible story has emerged really from that murder, which was the murder of a guy called David Byrne, but an attempt to kill Daniel Kinahan. And the third attempt, was it? Certainly the second attempt to kill him.
You know better than me, but yeah.
You're the expert here. There was Gary Hutch.
Yeah.
It depends whether you count the Red Cow.
Red Cow. Yeah. If that was an attempt on him in late 2015.
And it certainly was. Something botched happened that night and they weren't there just to sit in the car. And so this all, and of course then it became all eyes on Kinahan, what they were doing at that time. After the Regency in the documentary, we go to Spain and we look at the gym there, the MGM gym, what's happening with it, the arrest and the raids at the gym after the Kinahans have kind of gone on to Dubai, the change of name of the MGM to MTK, and you have always got this other massive story. I always find it difficult to tell the Kinahan story because you've got these two trajectories, don't you? You've got the organised crime bit and you have the boxing bit, which is seemingly the more legitimate type stuff. Well, certainly, it's like Daniel Kinahan has two faces, two jobs, two roles, two sides.
I think that's what makes this story so interesting to tell. Like there's a character, James Mulvey, who's in episode 3, who's a British criminal who was a kind of underboss for the Kinahan organisation, moving very large, I think it's about £100 million worth of cocaine that he's eventually convicted for moving for the Kinahan cartel. But you describe him brilliantly as you see a picture of him and you say, if you wanted an A to Z of how to look like a gangster, it's this guy.
Yeah.
And he is kind of a bit two-dimensional. You know, you think, okay, big, beefy guy, covered in tattoos, looks thuggish, and turns out he's a drug dealer. What makes the Kinahans so interesting is that there is so much more to them, you know. And Daniel's, you know, people talk about Christy Kinahan and his amazing ability to be a chameleon and change his accent, or, you know, to move in all these different worlds. And when you look at his time in Spain and you talk to the police officers who investigated him there, I spoke to the head of the money laundering unit of the main police force in Spain at their headquarters in Madrid. And he was saying, as far as he sees it, in the ranking of criminal minds, he said it goes God, Al Capone, Christy Kinahan.
Right.
And he said he said he's the most important criminal he's ever come across, because he was, and there were other people doing what he was doing at the same time, Curtis Warrens and people, but what he was seeing, because they were across all their phones and they were across all of the legitimate people they were using to help them move their money all over the world, what he'd never seen before was the scale of it, the business in China, in Hong Kong, in Brazil, and all of these places, and all of the incredible layering that was going on. And then Daniel's boxing story.
And before you move on to that was Operation Shovel, right?
Yeah.
So Spanish very confidently said they'd shut down the Irish Mafia, okay? And they did find all these businesses and everything. But you'd like to think that all that they found was stopped operating or whatever. So did they come back out of jail in 2010 and start again? Or did they just pick up where they left off? I mean, I'm talking about financially now, not positioning.
I think there'll be a good deal of it where they will have been able to carry on where they left off, because a great deal of it wasn't in Spain. You know, all of the really smart criminals base themselves in one jurisdiction and have their money and as much as they can, their criminal activities in another. Because one of the reasons that we were challenging the Spanish police and the Spanish prosecutors about why Shovel was such a disaster. And they pointed the finger at all of these other countries. And maybe that's, you know, a bit of just trying to divert blame. But actually, if you look at it, if you want to get information out of another jurisdiction, there's a lot of forms that have to be filled in. Everything's in Spanish. You have to get all of that translated into English, or it has to get translated the other end. You know, and the Operation Shovel police file is something like 40,000 pages. A great deal of that is just repeats of the same thing in a different language, or, you know, the bureaucracy is unbelievable.
Yeah.
So they had some relationships with the Gardaí and with British police and with Brazilian police, but they didn't have power to stop anything that was happening in those other countries. And if you look at, I think most of the businesses they were running, most of the places that the Spanish were seeing that their money wasn't in Spain. It was in Brazil, it was in Hong Kong, it was in China, it was in...
They realised they couldn't access it. And you know, funny enough, on the Europol website, it's still there, Operation Shovel, as one of the first multi-agency, cross-jurisdiction, successful, they call it, operations. I don't think they got practically a single charge out of it.
But I think it was just... But
it was new, wasn't it? I mean, it was the European Union countries starting to work together. Everybody in law enforcement tells you they are working together now. Everything we've seen of late, you know, from the EncroChat hack, etc., is showing that they are. There is trust built. There wasn't back then. And the Kinahans had a few cops in the pot.
Yeah, and they are oddly proud of it still over there. You know, they still, even though it was
the Spanish are proud of it.
Yeah, and I think part of that is because their police system works differently to how it would in, say, the UK and Ireland, where you have the police and then you have a prosecutor and then you have the court. And the police and the prosecutors work together a little bit so that if the police go to the DPP and say, we think we've got enough evidence to charge the Kinahans, if the prosecutors thinks there isn't, they'll say, well, we don't agree, but if you had this, this and this, maybe you'd have a stronger case. And they can, in Spain, the police kind of prepare their case and then they just take it to a magistrate and it's up to them to decide if the charges are there. And with Shovel, it just seems like they went far too early, maybe, or the people at the receiving end didn't have the resources to go through it. But also, I it's fair to say the police didn't find loads of drugs. They didn't find loads of guns. They had a lot of people talking on wiretaps, and it was all very, very suspicious. And they seized a great deal of assets, but a lot of those assets they gave back. And the police put that down to the Kinahans just got away with it. They were driving too fast in the cars, and I think any objective reading of the wiretaps evidence, there's clearly a very complex criminal conspiracy going on.
Yeah.
They didn't find the drugs and they didn't find the guns.
Yes.
And they went to court without that. And I think that's probably why it fell down.
Were the police in Spain afraid of them?
Well, they all protected their identity in the interviews. None of them showed their faces. And one of them told us that he's a larger gentleman. And he said two really interesting things. So they have this giant wiretap centre in Police HQ where they're bugging lots of different criminal gangs. And he said on the day of the Shovel raids, every gang, whatever nationality, they were all talking about the Kinahans, everybody.
Right.
Which gives you a sense of how far the tentacles
they were, yeah.
The other thing he said is that one of the things they heard on the wiretap was that the Kinahans wanted to kill the fat one. Which was him. So he was suddenly a little...
And did he give you detail of that, or was it just talk?
I think a lot of the time with these things, some of that can just be talk.
Yeah.
It can be somebody who isn't the Kinahans. It's somebody who's lower down saying someone ought to kill that guy or whatever. And it doesn't mean that one of the leaders of the cartel has put a hit out on this guy. I think it can just be big talk from someone further down the organisation. But if you're that guy, it's still pretty frightening, isn't it? It
sure is. And I mean, speaking of sort of wiretap surveillance stuff, you got amazing access to some of the surveillance of Mulvey. When he was under investigation. Absolutely incredible stuff. And we feel as if we're almost with the cops as they're peeking from the cars. And I actually find it amazing that it's similar to what you always think that if the cops are doing surveillance, it's going to be much more highbrow than what we would do. But it's actually quite similar.
I mean, as all three of us, as investigative journalists, we've sat there and done that.
Yeah.
And when I was saying before, we struggled to get criminals to talk on this. We've touched base with a few of them, but nobody that'll really come forward. But and so it is cops and journalists in this. But with the Mulvey stuff, some of it's been out there before. I mean, you should say for listeners to Crime World, our brief in all of this, our commission was to tell this to a new audience, particularly to a UK audience who've never heard it before. So a lot of this, the story's there, but what's new about it is some of the fine detail. And it is stuff like Mulvey. So a lot of the Mulvey wiretaps were out there, but some of them weren't. And we've culled some of them. We've got a lot of Undercover, as you know, because you've seen it, pictures of Mulvey. He was being tracked for a considerable length of time. We've got video the police were taking. And yeah, you can feel the investigation quite close up. And it's a couple of times we've let it run. So you can hear the cops in the car talking to each other about Mulvey. And it is that peek behind the curtain.
Well, sometimes in
and
the
Mulvey, we should say, is Thomas Bomber Kavanagh's cousin.
Yes.
They're all cousins. Yeah. But that's a Dublin thing, actually. But he is his cousin, and you also have really good access to the investigation around Bomber Kavanagh.
I mean, one of the fantastic kind of moments in the series really is when there is obviously an overlap in these two police investigations, one into Mulvey and one into Kavanagh, and the guys who are investigating Mulvey can clearly see that Kavanagh is at the top of the tree, but they don't have they have enough evidence to put his name on the indictment, but not to charge him. So he's named in the first investigation, but clearly they've been waiting years to kind of get to this guy, and they tell a great story about some surveillance. This is not in the film, but they told us a great story about doing surveillance on Kavanagh for the first time. He's with Liam Byrne in Heathrow Airport, and just the aura of the man. We just said they were on one of those airport shuttle things, just a few people behind him, and they said, he just even from a distance gave off this intimidating, powerful, aura. And as you mentioned in the film, there's a real insight into their relationship, and that world is when Gerard Hatchett Kavanagh is killed in Spain in 2014. He's being bugged on the day that happens, Mulvey, and you hear him making lots of phone calls. We're only able to use his end of the phone calls. We can't use everyone else's end. But you can hear him phoning a series of different people, associates, some criminal associates, some just friends, and he's trying to work out what's going on, who's done this, who's behind it, and it's clear he doesn't know But what's very clear is that he suspects that Bomber Kavanagh has sanctioned this hit on his cousin, and you can tell that he's angry, but he's also frightened. You can tell that he's frightened.
In all of this, we've tried to contact all of these people. So we've written to Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, we've written to the Kinahans. We've had those letters delivered. In Thomas Bomber Kavanagh's case, we've given him the opportunity to deny or we've put the allegation to him that he was involved in Jared Hatchett Kavanagh's killing, but he hasn't replied and hasn't come back to us on it.
He's staring at the wall somewhere in his prison cell.
Well, he was in Belmarsh prison. I'm not sure if he's there now.
Because I was actually going to say about him, he is the big man. He's very frightening. It's said of him that he has studied the science of fear, and he brings people to the edge of that moment when if he brings them too far, they become useless to him. Mentally, it seems to be some psychology. But for a guy like that, he sure as hell nearly crumbled when he realised he was himself facing a very lengthy time in prison because of all the drugs that he was caught, the evidence that they had gathered against him for in a subsequent case in more recent years. And you actually have that recording as the penny drops with him, really.
Yeah. I mean, it's an amazingly complicated investigation. So I won't go into too much detail, but to summarise it,
be here a while.
They as you know, EncroChat and all the rest of them, I can't remember which particular system it was, but they were using encrypted phones. And then even within the encrypted phones, people have handles like you would on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. So there's all these different people, Smiley, Jelly, within these chats. And most of them are well below Thomas Kavanagh. But there's one name that keeps coming up, which is the Gaffer.
Yeah.
And, anyone who's watched a crime movie knows that the Gaffer's the boss.
Yeah.
So the NCA, they say to us in the interview, like, clearly you want to know who the Gaffer is. And their job is to prove that it's Bomber Kavanagh. And it's very difficult for them to do that because he's good at what he does. So they have to follow him. He has a criminal phone, the Gaffer phone, and he has his own phone. And they have to follow him around all over the Midlands and try and show that these two phones are often in the same place at the same time as him, etc. And a great breakthrough bit of evidence they find is a text to him on the criminal phone that has a picture of basically his granddaughter who's just been born and wearing a baby Kavanagh baby grow. And it's part of the interview where this information is put to him, where he has this panic attack basically and collapses, and they have to go and get there. And it's amazing to hear. And it's actually your heart rate goes up as you hear it.
You can nearly hear the penny drop with him, and then you start hearing the gasps, and then they sort of stop the questioning and start, Thomas, are you okay, Thomas?
You can hear the fear in the room. I mean, there's a genuine. It really does just get your adrenaline up just listening to it.
And for him, it's that realization that he's going to have to do time, which he obviously clearly doesn't like doing, because while in prison facing those charges, he came up with a plot to dump some weapons in north of Ireland in order to tip off the police, in order to get himself a lower sentence. A guy like him, it's extraordinary. Somebody as tough as that, it always seems amazing that they just cannot do their time themselves, Yeah,
the other thing that's amazing about this story as well, actually, when we're just all talking now, are the characters and the depth of the characters. I mean, if you were scripting a drama, you've got Daniel in that character and the boxing. You've got Christy Senior, in the brains. You bring in, we haven't even touched on the Hutches and Jerry Hutch, the monk. Thomas Bomber Kavanagh. I mean, some of this is down to you guys as journalists and naming them and doing all the work and the research on them. But in terms of what the two of us always knew was in doing this, that you can't go wrong with this material because it's like Narcos Europe, isn't it? Completely.
Well, and it's also like it's Greek tragedy, it's Shakespeare. Like they all have these kind of story arcs that, like, if you went and did like a screenwriting course, how to write a movie or whatever, you've got the Daniel's kind of aspiration, and then he's got the very successful father, and then hubris gets him in the end. Like that's a classic Hollywood trope. You've got Daniel and Gary's relationships all going, and then it all explodes, and you've got the feud. That's another kind of classic, and you have these overlaps in all of their storylines, at the same time as you've got the story of the police. You know, the police are desperate to catch them, getting closer and closer, but
they keep getting further
they're always
away.
Just ahead.
Don't they?
Yeah.
That's what it seems to be. Talk about the boxing, because you're the expert on this. So, Daniel Kinahan. So you talked to Tris Dixon in the program, actually. So he gives us a good insight, really, into why boxing turned a blind eye on this. But where, like, in the pecking order of boxing globally, does Daniel Kinahan get to?
The very top. I mean, the absolute pinnacle. Well, he was operating at a level, you touched on it in the podcast in recent weeks, because there's a court case going on. I'll not get too much into it. It'll be here forever. And, you know, it's legally sensitive. But the court case in America where a former Top Rank employee is suing Top Rank. And when you get into the weeds of that, and they're talking about Daniel Kinahan negotiating the heavyweight boxing world championship. He's acting as guarantor for part of that fight. He had, I would argue as a boxing fan, that when you got to around 2017, 18, 19, he had the most impressive roster of boxers in world boxing. He had people, you know, Tyson Fury and others. He was at the very top. He was eating at the top table. It was like a takeover of boxing. That was the plan. And if it hadn't been for the American sanctions, I think he would have seen it through.
I mean, he was really well placed as well, because a lot of those people who are at the top table in boxing talk about him in public. You know, it wasn't hidden in that. That was the amazing thing about it. His public face, once the noise around the Regency had kind of died down a bit. You know, you had people who are the biggest promoters in the sport of boxing using his name, announcing him as their advisor. You know, no one was kind of denying him. And he was in the Middle East at a time when boxing was about to kind of pivot towards the Middle East. And now there's a huge amount of boxing in that part of the world. And had Daniel not had a major criminal past, had it not been exposed, you know, had it not all kind of been built on sand because of his connections, who knows where it would have finished.
It was easy to see how big Daniel was in boxing, because within a very short space of time, there was 200 plus fighters on the books. I don't think there'd been anything like MGM/MTK. On that scale before, people were going out and having training camps, nice facilities, all expenses paid, loads of sparring. He started to get some top fighters, some guys with world honours or who were knocking on the door of world titles.
But I have to give him this, right? And I don't give him very much, but I will give him this. No one else wanted Tyson Fury or believed in him. And he did. It was incredible thing that happened, that he got back to fitness, that he got back in that ring. Do you agree? Or are you
100%? And I mean, it's another one of those story arcs that Tim talks about. And part of the problem with the Kinahan story is that, look, we know what the Kinahans are and what the Kinahans have done, but there are other sides of the Kinahans. And at times you do have to, you choose your language carefully, because when you say you got to give them credit, but Christie Sr. is clearly a top-notch businessman. Daniel doesn't seem to be that far behind him.
No.
And he has the business acumen, and he could do what he did in sport. I can't remember if it was you or maybe Michael O'Sullivan at one point said to us, you know, Christie had a choice. Christie Sr., he's a middle-class upbringing. He had all the talents to go a different way. He could have gone Wall Street. He decided to go the criminal route. But you have to give, unfortunately, credit. It's a 1 billion, we're told, €1 billion empire they've built.
To get from the streets of Dublin to that, like, and to be mixing and you know, rubbing shoulders with royalty, and it is an extraordinary tale.
The other thing about Daniel in particular, I think, is that when you talk to people who are in boxing, or when you just read what they were saying about him, there'll be some people who, you know, he was the next best thing and he was paying for their free training in Marbella, and they thought, fantastic, yeah, I'll go and do that. But there are very clearly a very large number of boxers in particular whose lives he absolutely changed. People like Peter McDonough, who will credit him with turning their life around. There are other people who are not boxers but around him at the time who credit him with, and they look at him as this kind of, I don't know, not Messiah is not the word, but he is a hero.
He is a guru.
He is a hero.
He is a guru.
And they do, they really admire him. And he has obviously made their lives much better, and they have huge respect for it. And you can't, clearly, they aren't looking at the other side of the picture. But that is their kind of truth, if you like it. They really do believe that. And you can't deny that he has had that effect on a large number of individuals. Obviously, you can't ignore the way it's been funded,
But getting back to the father, whose first and foremost thing was he was a fraudster. He is a convincing liar, as is Daniel. And in a lot of ways, he's become a guru to many people. Maybe you'll disagree or whatever. But he's become, by feeding them what is a lie.
It is a fraud. I firmly believe that as well. Even in the past week, I've spoken to someone who's completely cannot believe what he hears about Daniel, because he says he only knows Daniel in a certain way. And you've talked about it before in sort of cultish terms. I wonder at what point the penny drops with people in the boxing fraternity who came out and spoke and stuck up for Daniel and attacked people like you and the other great Irish journalists who've covered this story. At what point the penny drops that, to some degree, a large degree, I would argue, Daniel used them. He used them almost as a little army within boxing, not in any criminal way, but he rode on the backs of them like a Tyson Fury to the top of boxing by selling them a fraud and telling them and lying to them to tell them that he wasn't this criminal, that he was being
and
portrayed.
Marketing it too. I mean, he's a very clever PR man.
Yeah.
If you look straight after the Joshua tweet, in the wake of the Panorama, there are suddenly a lot of people being interviewed by journalists who have connections. Journalists is not the wrong word. Content creators who have connections with Daniel Kinahan, might even be funded by Daniel Kinahan. And they're being thrown questions about, tell me about Daniel's influence in boxing. And if you sort of go through the YouTube history, you'll see that there's maybe 10 videos posted over 2 days where everyone's been asked that as the fifth or sixth question. And it starts to look like an orchestrated PR campaign to boost his reputation. And that's around the same time that you had the Regency documentary and the book and the Jay Spades rap. And, these things aren't happening by accident. There's a very deliberate attempt to try and build a brand.
And that narrative is this kind of, it's an anti-media, it's an anti-establishment thing, and everyone's out to get him. And people believe that, don't they? You see those boxers and people who there's no money involved in that. Okay, the boxers have been paid. Set that aside for a minute. He can go to a lawyer, for example, and he can pay him a massive amount of money to go and say this about him, to a PR company, pay them a massive amount of money. That's a business transaction. But if you have fallen for the personality, you have believed that, you have gone for the sort of the person and what the person, you're going to be much more hurt, and it's much harder to untangle that if you've believed it to such an extent, isn't it?
There's two ways to look at it. It's whether you ever untangle it or you just take a decision that, okay, he may well be a crime boss and a criminal, but I don't know that person.
Yes.
I know him for how he helped me. And I think a lot of them it's not willful blindness. Well, it is willful blindness, but they've taken a decision. I'm going to stick with the Daniel that I know. And I'm not sure you can ever get through that.
What did you find in the Netherlands?
The Netherlands is such an interesting example because at the same time as you had the feud here and all of those murders, as you know, in the Netherlands, they had all of the drama around the other members of the so-called super cartel who were, in particular, Ridwan Taghi, and all of the murders that were happening in relation to the criminal case against him and the witness who was giving evidence against him. You had journalists and you had lawyers being killed. You had rocket launchers fired at news buildings. You had a van full of explosives driven into a news building. And what's interesting about it is a point that you and Nicola made on this podcast before, is that the chaos that was happening in the Netherlands happens at the same time as the chaos that's happening over here, happens at the same time as this super cartel appears to be kind of coming together and growing. And there's a guy called Miles Johnson, I think you've interviewed Miles on this podcast as well, who makes a really good point that if you are pumping that much cocaine, as much cocaine as Europol says the super cartel was pumping, a third of the UK market, a third of the European market, if that much cocaine is being pumped into any environment, whether or not it's members of the super cartel or bosses or whatever who are responsible for those individual crimes or not, the kind of the outworkings of that much cocaine, people will fight over it. You know, there are gangs lower down the kind of wholesaling chain. If someone's going to rob someone, someone's going to shoot someone, you know, it kind of, and I think one of the reasons, there are 3 or 4 reasons why the Americans took this so seriously. But a serious reason was that they became, and we talked to the Gregory Getjanis from the US Treasury about this, that one of the things that really concerned them was that this group of people, and the Kinahans at the heart of it, were becoming a threat to European democracies who are allies of the United States, Ireland, the Netherlands, and also in the Balkans, where Eden Gashin was. Their DEA had an operation there called Operation Black Tie, which was a kind of follow-up to Operation Desert Storm, which took out Gashin in Dubai. And it was all about, they'd got into these encrypted phones, and they'd found that there were people in places you really wouldn't expect, public officials within law enforcement, within the judiciary, who were clearly on the payroll, journalists. He had kind of bought, I mean, it was the most widespread corruption that he's been accused of over there. And all of that worried the US too, because it's not just about, you know, the damage done by the drugs or the criminality. It's the threat to these states that they wanted to take down.
And you've met loads of people. Some people have, you know, are interviewed on camera. Some people hide their identities, including a very interesting story we're told by a former member of the Guards who followed Imre Arakas into town and watched him as he pretended that he was a fishing enthusiast or a camper or something like that. He was obviously here to kill Mago Gately. An incredible story, Imre Arakas, his background, his, you know, yet another, it's almost like a stage, isn't it? And another character enters it.
Well, you spoke to him how many times? Many.
You spoke to Imre.
I had an ongoing relationship with Imre for maybe 6 months, where he would ring me from prison about once a week or once every 2 weeks. And we got into this process with him. We were trying to film him, weren't we, for ages, because they actually allowed him in Lithuania to speak down a line on a Zoom or a Teams link or whatever it was we used. And we had so many glitches and problems with cameras and getting it all to work. And we eventually did get it to work. We got him recorded a couple of times. We never took the whole process as far as we wanted to take it. We wanted to get more into deeper into the Kinahans. We were starting him off with some gentle questions. Yes. I have to say, I found him very personable. But
what did he have to say?
Well, he would be telling me about how much weight he was losing because he was living on a diet of basically gruel porridge in the morning and cabbage soup, watery cabbage soup for lunch.
Sorry from no.
And proper porridge, that.
Yeah, quite a bit of the time I was talking to him, he'd had that. There were rumours of a stroke. He said it wasn't a stroke, but I can't remember what it was. But he was in actually the hospital wing. But I used to put him on speaker, and my wife would be listening and go, "Is he on to you again?" You know,
the Estonian hitman in prison in Lithuania, like a life less ordinary.
I mean, he's another one with an amazing story, though. I mean, the wrestler turned international man of mystery. But one of my favourite lines in the whole film, Stephen's asking him what he's doing in Dublin, because he goes to all of these addresses that are linked to places that past murders have happened against members of the Hutch organised crime group or the Hutch family. And he just says, the centre of Dublin isn't very big and Hutches live everywhere. Right. I was just going for a walk.
Happened to be.
And that's still his story. You know, he still proclaims his innocence, even though he pleaded guilty.
Yeah.
He says, "Oh yeah, it was just easier for me to plead guilty."
He was caught, of course, here in Dublin when he was planning to kill Mago Gately in the north. He was followed into town and arrested in Blakestown cottages, and I think he pleaded guilty to conspiracy to murder. Did his time here, 6 years or thereabouts, and then he was extradited to Lithuania, where he faced another murder charge, where he seems to have got 8 years for that one.
Mm. Yeah. He's gone down to 2.
2 years for murder.
Yeah. Two different murders he's gone down for. But I can't remember how much.
Should we get on murder?
You lose count at that stage. But the thing I like, I mean, we recount the Imre Arakas story and him arriving, as people who listen to this podcast know, arriving in Dublin off a plane. So what we have is the undercover officer who gets the instructions from Dave Gallagher and Seamus Boland, who are together in Dublin Castle, and they get a phone call from Europe to say, you might want to take a look at your arrivals at Dublin Airport. You've got Imre Arakas coming. They knew who Imre Arakas was already. They say in the film, we knew who this man was. We knew we could possibly expect him.
Right.
And here he was arriving, and the Undercover and his team had something like 40 minutes to get from the centre of Dublin. And we know all about the Dublin traffic. I'm sick of the Dublin traffic.
I know.
And we lay the tail out from there as they go after him, and he eventually gets
There's another really interesting thing that doesn't make the film, but people who enjoy this podcast would be interested in. So within the investigation into Bomber Kavanagh, I was telling you they had to go through all of those messages. There are two guys who were working directly for Bomber Kavanagh on moving weapons and cocaine. They're currently they've been jailed. And they were messaging each other on the day that the follow-up failed hit on James Gately. Do you remember they tried to kill him at the garage, Topaz Garage? And they are frustrated, these two younger members of the gang, because they can't get any sense out of Bomber Kavanagh because he's so cross that James Gately's still alive.
It's in the text. He spotted it in the text messages. Yeah,
Unbelievable, isn't it?
So just kind of shows you that the way that
it's business. Murder is business, and it's gone wrong, and he's cross, and
we were still at that time.
Can't get a decent hitman, obviously.
Yeah, we were still at that time, May 2017. So the thing was still driving forward, and that was even after, Bomber's weapons factory at Greenogue had been unearthed.
And of course, Daniel Kinahan is always in the background. He's the overlord of Bomber Kavanagh and sanctioning everything. So May 2017, he's ultimately sending, Imre Arakas into Ireland to kill while he's having a wedding in the Burj Al Arab, the 7-star hotel. Yeah. He's getting married. Very famous wedding.
Mm-hmm.
We know that the police were aware of the wedding, right? We don't know whether they were at the wedding. We know from, I think, is it El Rico's trial, that there are photos of the wedding that show some of the members of the alleged super cartel together, kind of. But one of the other lines that will be in episode 4 of our series, we interviewed one of the police officers who was investigating Johnny Morrissey.
Right.
And he said that when they raided his house, on the wall as they went in was a seating plan for the wedding. And he said it read like a catalogue of organised crime.
Right.
So
on the wall of Johnny Morrissey's house was a seating plan for Daniel Kinahan's wedding. He kept it as a souvenir.
Framed on the wall.
Isn't it? Something else. Johnny Morrissey, for anyone who doesn't recall, was the Kinahans' money man in Spain, who was, where is he at?
He's on bail.
He's on bail, and he hasn't been officially charged yet, or has he?
I don't think so, because the way it works in Spain. But there was a great deal of fanfare around his arrest. There was a Europol, DEA, and Guardia Civil in Spain operation where they accused him of being a major money launderer for the Kinahan cartel. This was after he'd been sanctioned by the US authorities, who also said that he was a money launderer.
And he, of course, up to that point, was doing a Daniel Kinahan on it in Spain. He was living it up with Nero.
He was very out there. He was very much in the public eye.
I used to watch his social media all the time. I was a follower of his on Facebook and everything, and he was having parties, and himself and his wife were like having dinner parties. She used to video herself setting the table. I mean, it's just bizarre, isn't it?
But their story is another, that it's. I mean, I do think if you took all of these stories and went to somebody who was, commissioning a drama for a big streamer, they'd go, no, it's a bit too much.
Yeah, it's too much.
Because you've got so many of these, Imre Arakas, Johnny Morrissey, Bomber Kavanagh, James Mulvey, all of the Kinahans, the monk.
Yeah.
These are all kind of once in a lifetime characters for any novelist or...
I often thought that about the whole sort of Kinahan, the coming together of everybody, that it was like, it's maybe a bit crass to describe it like this, but it's like one of those super football teams. That they're only there in a moment, all these characters together.
Yeah.
And you probably won't have them again for another. Yeah. You don't get this sort of collection.
Coalesced.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's the same with those Amsterdam. The Amsterdam journalists we spoke to talked about how a lot of the members of the so-called super cartel were all in Amsterdam at the same time, and they would all have criminal connections, from that time, and then they're all in Spain at that time.
Yeah.
And there are these real chapters in the history of crime in Europe which is, I made a film about the Liverpool Mafia before this one, and it's all the same period. You know, it's the same. It's Amsterdam, Spain, Dubai, and these people all go way back, and it's like being one of the first shareholders in Facebook. I think if you were one of the early movers in when the Colombian and the Latin American cartels were trying to get cocaine into Europe, if you were in the right place at the right time and you had the right skills, you could go from zero to the very top extremely quickly.
I think when we talk about how unbelievable this story is, when we get to episode 4, which we still haven't finished, and we'll be having some sleepless nights about, because we have to get that prep to get that out in the middle of April. It'll follow the first 3. But when you get to that stage, and you get to the stage of Hezbollah, Iran, the US government, you know, at that stage, when I mention that to people who are saying, what are you doing? And where are they now? And where does that story go? They just can't believe it. It's just so fantastical.
Your head starts to spin at that point, doesn't it?
There's some great characters in episode 4. I mean, we won't say too much about it now for various reasons, but I think for your listeners and for those who'll watch it, well, we know this story because, you know, we've heard all of this on Crime World a lot. But in episode 4, I think we're both excited about episode 4 because it's more current and there's new voices in it and people you haven't heard speak before, such as former DEA agent Jack Kelly talking about the Kinahans. The DEA have never talked about the Kinahans.
We see him briefly in episode 1, which is on tonight. And we see we get a bit of a teaser about him, and I think he is amazing the way he sort of says, like he's got a great turn of phrase. Yeah. But of course, you know, Daniel Kinahan made himself a sparkly thing, didn't he? And
sparkly,
you know, it was come and get me, and he says there's officers out there all over the world that want his, you know, his head on their wall, don't they?
We had a great time with Jack Kelly's a character. You know, he began as a work in the streets of Manhattan. You know, he's a New Jersey man. I'll not try the accent, but you only have to put a camera on. He's a performer. Right. You know, you get the voice. We've got Ralph Heredia, who's a American-Mexican, and he's the guy who, him and his brother, sued Daniel and MTK in the courts. Another incredible character. I mean, these are crazy characters, but great people and people of
and
great
a nice
integrity.
House.
Yes, we've shown you Ralph Heredia's house, haven't we?
Ralph, there's a word, as kind of a Latin American Spanish word, chingon, he says, which means nice shit, is the way he explains it. Okay. And he says that's what he likes. And his house, I mean, he's a phenomenal character. I mean, he lives in this huge house. He has a Ferrari and a couple of Mercedes and a swimming pool and all the rest of it. But what's really interesting is that behind, he has, you know, he's a very, very charismatic guy, very, very confident. But beneath all of that, he's also really wounded because MTK, he had this fighter, Jojo Diaz, who he sued Daniel and MTK over, who, you know, he says he'd put his whole life into getting this guy to win the world championship. And then a few months later, he signed for MTK. Yeah. And you can tell when he starts talking about it, he gets really emotional.
And Barry McGuigan's similar, like, isn't obviously the same kind of character. But he was very emotional by the boxers he lost.
So wounded. So we interviewed Barry for the Panorama. Barry isn't in this, but the parallels between the Heredia and Barry McGuigan's stories are there. Yeah. You know, both had boxers. They invested great time in really deep personal relationships. In Barry's case, it was with Carl Frampton. But Ralph invested so much emotion in Jojo Diaz, and in both Barry and Ralph are so wounded, and it's so personal. And it's personal with Daniel Kinahan because they blame him for stealing these guys away from them.
And what is, we'll wrap this up now as well. I'm going to let you, by the way, say your thing you need to say about
it. Him to say it.
No. Oh yeah, he's going to have to say it. I'll Google it. Will any of us remember it? I don't even remember the email here. But anyway, I'll ask you. Did you contact the Kinahans for comment?
We did.
What did they have to say?
A lawyer for the Kinahans said that rumours and theories about them have never been tested in a court of law, and that a major investigation spanning 5 countries, they're referring to Operation Shovel, ended with the main charges against them being dismissed.
Look at the big brain on him.
It's just a memory. It's not a brain. Anyone can do that.
That is impressive. I mean, we reached out. We were trying. I had a number of email addresses for the Kinahans, Christy Senior and Daniel, and they were delivered. The email addresses are still open. They haven't been closed. Nothing came back. But Tim and should mention Carlos Underwood, who you met. Yes. Carlos is our Mexican friend who did a lot of great work on the Spanish end of this, and a great guy and filmmaker himself. And Tim and Carlos stumbled in to a Kinahan lawyer in Spain.
Yeah, we were trying to get more information about Operation Shovel, and we wanted to see if we could find more documents or the wiretaps themselves. And we had a meeting with some prosecutors, and they said, well, there's a lawyer that you should go and see because he would have seen the documents. They didn't tell us anything more about this lawyer. So we went and met him in a very, very, very fancy hotel, gentleman's club type environment in Marbella. And we're asking him if he might have these documents. And he told us that, yes, he would, because he's the lawyer for Christopher Sr., Christopher Jr., Daniel. But that was great for us because you want to speak to these people. Yeah. You want to put your allegations before them. And we had a very long conversation with him. We laid out, all of the things that everybody has said about the Kinahans, what their defense might be. He pushed back very hard and said, these people haven't been found guilty. If they were guilty that when the Spanish did that investigation, why aren't they in prison? Why hasn't anybody? And, you can't deny that they aren't in prison.
Yep.
He's right on that. But the challenge for us as investigative journalists doing a story like this, normally you can get a response out of the people you're investigating. And it's far more satisfying when you do, because you can test what's being said about them, and you can get more to the kind of truth of who they really are. And it's a real, obviously, I think it would be very difficult for them to give an interview right now, so I can understand why they didn't come and sit down in front of a camera. But yeah, it would have been so great to be able to get a response straight from them. But
the story's not over.
Well, it's not over by a long chalk, and it'll be following it. I mean, it should be said.
Or are you giving up?
No, I'm not giving up. But you're usually 3 or 4 steps ahead of me.
We should say actually, we owe a huge debt to Nicola and to Niall and to Paul Williams and Stephen Breen, Michael Doyle, Owen Conlon. A lot of very, very brave journalists who've done all of the work on this. And really, our films are just the kind of, and also to all the police officers who've done all of that work. Our films really are just the kind of tribute to the story of all of you who've taken huge personal risks and invested masses of time and done an amazing job in telling this story and getting it out there. Because I don't think this story, if it had happened in England, where I'm from, never would it have been out there, because journalists don't behave in the same way. The police don't, so we wouldn't have been able to tell it in the way that we do. And you've all been very generous with your time. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we're just, I know this is all getting a bit pat each other in the back time, but when you hear certain people like there were boxers for MTK slagging the Irish media, and the media gets a bad rap. But I mean, this story, part of the reason, or difficulty for us coming to this story, was trying to bring new elements to it, because the work that's been done has been so courageous and so thorough already. And so we are hanging on your coattails a bit, but the privilege for us is taking this to a new audience, particularly in the UK. But people in Ireland will be able to watch this over the next 4 weeks, BBC Northern Ireland. So it'll be tonight, and then for the next 3 Mondays. It's going to go out in BBC One, we hope, in the UK. It's going to be the UK iPlayer. So
and I've watched it. Well, I've certainly watched the first 3 episodes, and it is incredible. It is the absolute penultimate Kinahan experience, is it? Kinahan cartel experience. Get out the popcorn, people. It's at 20 to 11
tonight on BBC One Northern Ireland, and then the subsequent 3 Mondays after that. So we've got 4 episodes.
And if you watch it, if you're in the UK and you watch the first 3 on the iPlayer, just wait, because there will be a 4th one.
Okay.
A couple of weeks later, and it will be the best one.
Yeah. And we can't get the iPlayer. I know. Can you not sort that out?
I don't have the power. I wish I did.
It's really annoying.
I wish I did.
Yeah.
Well, I have to annoy you looking for stuff to be sent to me, because I can't. Yeah. I don't know how to scramble my IP address. Are you allowed to do that? Is that illegal? Sorry.
I couldn't possibly comment. Conversation. We can't get RTE either, so It's
can you not? Can you not get the player?
Maybe you can on Sky.
You can find it up your channel somewhere. I watch a bit of it.
Bet it's there. But anyway, it's a brilliant show and 2 years in the making. And best of luck. Fingers crossed. I think it's going to go down really well.
Thank you.
All right.
Robbie Lawler was out of control.
This is Double Cross,
the murder of Robbie Lawler.
It was going to be an all-out war with him in the middle of it.
Crime World special investigation podcast based on my new book, Web of Betrayal, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.